Well, thank you everybody for joining us for our Truth in Accounting First Ask the Experts webinar. Today, we are thankful that the Union League Club of Chicago is co-sponsoring this event. And today's topic is the economic impact of COVID-19 on state revenues. I am Sheila Weinberg. I'm the founder and CEO of Truth in Accounting, a nonprofit educational organization. As a nonprofit, we are always looking for new partners and supporters interested in our work. So if we don't get to your questions at the end, feel free to reach out to us and contact us about that. I started Truth in Accounting in 2002 over my frustration that citizens were really not being given the financial information they need to be knowledgeable participants in their governments. They can't figure out whether their states are in good shape or bad states, even who to vote for. So Truth in Accounting was formed. And since then, we've started a website called truthinaccounting.org. And when you go on that website, I urge you all to, you might want to ignore the national debt clock. It doesn't look pretty, I'm sorry, and it's spinning really, really fast these days. Do scroll down to the bottom of the page and you can sign up for our morning call and other newsletters. And I know that you're all in quarantine, house arrest for more than 100 days. So for some fun, I urge you to go to our sister website, dataz.org. There you can create your own charts to compare the cities and the states and the federal government using more than 700 data points. So I urge you to have some fun on create your own charts. Today's event is based upon a piece titled Preparing for a Rainy Day that I was honored to co-write with our guest speaker today, Eileen Norcross. Eileen is one of countless Americans who took on an unexpected, daunting role during the crisis, homeschooling her children. She also is the vice president and policy research and senior fellow at the Mercatus Center of George Mason University. Her specialties include fiscal federalism, government finances, and pensions. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Rutgers. Also joining me and Eileen today is another accidental homeschooler and Truth in Accounting's in-house expert, Bill Bergman. He is our director of research and he delivers that daily morning call newsletter. He aggregates all the federal, state, and local government budgeting and accounting stories. So sign up for the newsletter and you'll get that from Bill Bergman every day. He was the former policy analysis at the Federal Reserve of Chicago and now teaches finance courses at Loyola University. For today, everyone will get a chance to ask questions in our Q&A feature. Don't use our chat feature at the bottom. Go ahead and you'll see on the left side, you'll see the mute button, then start video, and then the Q&A button. Just type in your question. We're gonna try to answer as many questions as we can. We had more than 100 people sign up for this event, so we might not get to everyone, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'll turn it over to Eileen and Bill for comments, and then we'll get to your questions. Eileen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you for inviting me today to talk about this really important issue of where we are with state finances. The nature of the shock that we've experienced in the last few months is certainly different than anything in living memory. And we can't really compare it to previous recessions and depressions due to the very nature of it. But that doesn't mean that we haven't been here before, in the sense that every so often we can expect a financial shock, an economic shock, a recession. It's to be expected. So the question for states right now is, what have they done and what should they be doing to build firm fiscal foundations? How prepared were they going into this latest fiscal crisis? We know it was only 12 years ago during the last recession that many fault lines were revealed in state finances. We saw deeply underfunded pension systems, unfunded other post-employment benefits, those healthcare and other benefits that are provided to public workers. We saw lots of fiscal gimmickry and evasive tactics in how states were balancing their budgets, whether it was taking on more debt or papering over gaps by moving funds around or accounting gimmicks. And we saw that many states hadn't really saved up for a rainy day. So what's happened in the last 12 years? A lot of analysis has been done to point out these flaws and these risks. And on a few fronts, we've seen progress. We've seen states undertake some kind of pension reform. The question is it enough for some of our most deeply underfunded states? Currently, depending on how you want to estimate the shortfall, unfunded pension liabilities are anywhere from 2 trillion to 5.9 trillion currently in unfunded liabilities. OPEB benefits, while there's been some progress made in filling in these holes, there's still a lot of work to be done, with over a dozen states having nothing saved for those benefits. And lastly, on rainy day funds, there has been progress. Some states have put some money aside, even enough to get through this current crisis. But much more work needs to be done on that front. So we have to give them credit on some dimensions, but I would just urge that we have to continue to bolster fiscal foundations. Crises can be expected. We don't always have good years. We have to prepare for the bad years.
Oh, well, thank you, Eileen, so much. Bill, do you have some opening comments?
Sure. By way of background, I've got a lot of respect for Eileen. It's really nice to be here with her today. And to echo what she was talking about, are we in a crisis? Was this unforeseeable? I'm reminded of a story told by a financial market leader recently. His daughter, he said, came up to him and asked, "What's a financial crisis, Dad?" He said, "That's something that happens every 7 years." They always come from different directions, but they always happen, and they happen regularly. So is this something that we can blame on Mother Nature? I don't think so. You have to be prepared for Mother Nature, given that you know that this is something that's out there. I've heard the metaphor, a perfect storm, applied to recent events, just as I heard it applied to the events back in 2008, 2009. In a sense, this is not a productive analogy. However, a perfect storm implies that it's something that's not humans' faults. And in fact, we have a responsibility as humans to be prepared for Mother Nature when these things arrive. I'm afraid we learned too many good lessons from the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and not necessarily in a productive manner. The bailouts that were there for the financial markets and the financial system weren't unnoticed. And I'm afraid our state and local governments went into the most recent crisis thoroughly unprepared, in part because of the moral hazard associated with those bailouts. And today we're going to be reaping the fruits of it. We're in a very tough spot.
Oh, thank you, Bill. Yeah, but some of the governors, like Governor Pritzker and Governor Newsom, they're saying that their states were in fine financial shape before this happened. In fact, both Governor Pritzker and Governor Newsom were saying their states ran surpluses, and all the states, have a balanced budget requirement. So you'd think that all the states are doing fine, but what we've found, and Eileen highlighted a little bit, was that it all depends on how you count. And government officials have a very sophisticated way of counting that I'll call political math. 49 of the 50 states do have balanced budget requirements. But what we've found is in our financial state of the states, where we analyze the true financial condition of every single state, we find that the states are $1.5 trillion in debt, even though they balance their budgets. So how can that happen? Well, as Eileen highlighted, they use accounting gimmicks. They record loan proceeds as revenues. They move money around into the budgeted funds from the non-budgeted funds, and somehow that becomes revenue. Then they just don't include all their costs. They only include the checks they plan to write. So if they don't plan to properly fund their pension plan, they can still balance their budget by not funding their pension plan. And one of the largest funds is the general fund, and that's the largest and most important budgeted funds. And what we're trying to do is get the states so they're not in these horrible financial shapes when crisis happens. We're trying to get them to use fact-based budgeting, which is full accrual calculations and techniques. And this would eliminate most of the accounting gimmicks that they use to pretend they balance their budget while they go into debt at the same time. We are also working on looking at the deceptive accounting practices used to in their financial statements for the general fund, in which that they can point to these financial statements and look, they show that our funds were, that our state was really balanced. But again, they're using shoddy, bad accounting, antiquated cash-based accounting. That type of accounting, the IRS doesn't allow a corporation to use because it's so misleading. But that's how the governments budget and account for their general fund. So these shoddy budgeting and accounting practices have left the states woefully unprepared to handle any crisis, much less the ones that we have now. Eileen, the current crisis is resulting in unprecedented financial consequences for the states. Is the current crisis unprecedented, and should these states have been prepared?
Mm-hmm. I think it's unprecedented in the nature of the crisis, in that you had a pandemic, a lockdown on many economies, very unexpected, a very drastic hit to sales tax revenues, income revenues. So the nature of it, I think, is a little unique. But that's not to say states haven't experienced crises. Of course, the amount of revenues that states are looking at losing, as your analysis has shown, is significant. How quickly they come out of this is a question. It all depends on how quickly they get back into the economy and how those revenues rebound. So I wouldn't compare it to the last fiscal crisis, but I would say crises are somewhat regular, and the behaviors that we see don't give me a lot of confidence. And I would highlight in one area, which is taking on risk. We saw after the last financial crisis that pensions took on more risk in their investments, and yet they continue to do so. So that's a warning sign that they haven't internalized the lessons of previous crises. And while the nature of this crisis might be different, and maybe even the depth of it is a lot more serious, we can say that crises in fact happen, and states need to be better prepared to deal with them.
And Bill, why do you think that they haven't internalized this risk?
I think they feel shielded from the impact of their decisions. The people with decision-making authority capture the upside, but the downside is socialized in a way that allows them to take more risk. One of the lessons we didn't learn from the savings and loan crisis back in the 1980s was that, theoretically, solvent institutions, they looked solvent on the books, but they weren't really solvent because of the ambiguous, if not deceptive, nature of regulatory accounting principles allowed a lot of insolvent institutions to stay around. And if you're an insolvent institution and you get the upside, but the risk is on the downside is socialized, you have an incentive to go to Vegas. And unfortunately, after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, we only saw things move into the direction of more risk, not less risk, in our public pension funds. And in recent weeks, we've seen new decisions at CalPERS, the biggest pension fund in America, that has announced an explicit attempt to leverage higher on the pension fund and take more risk to achieve these assumed returns that help them report lower liabilities. So it's kind of a nightmare. Eileen can talk about that.
Yeah, and Bill, if the governments lose, on this gamble, they're making this huge gamble. If they happen to lose, do pensioners usually lose their benefits? Or do they take less benefits? What usually happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does depend. We've only seen a few cases now at the local level of what happens when an entity ends up bankrupt. We've seen the city of Vallejo, Stockton, Central Falls, Detroit, all very different cases. And in those cases, with the exception of Central Falls, we saw that governments did their best to protect the benefits and have the creditors take that loss. Benefits were reduced in Detroit, but then we see other instances where the creditors are asked to bear a little bit more of the burden. So it really does depend, and we only have the localities to look at right now because we haven't seen a state, of course, enter into bankruptcy, as it's not available to them currently.
Well, we did have good economic times in recent years. Did any of the states take advantage of this, or what should they have done during those good economic times?
Yeah, I think they should have started with a hard look at their accounting. There was some progress made as you and I, we wrote an article together looking at the new accounting standards, GASB 67 and 68, and that forced these entities, the governments, to put their liabilities on the balance sheet. They made some adjustments to things like asset smoothing and how the liabilities are calculated, but they really didn't go the full distance to a full valuation of these liabilities. A failure to internalize the true size of the liabilities and the ability to evade the annual payment through either saying, hey, we've got a bunch of good years here, we don't have to put the full amount into the fund this year, or just skipping out on it altogether because they simply don't have the funds. These kind of behaviors have just compounded the underfunded liabilities in a lot of these plans. Other plans have been better actors, so it's not the same for every plan or for every state, but habitually not contributing to the fund because, frankly, it's a relatively large number in some cases, and they tend to put off today what they think they can do tomorrow, and that's not necessarily the case.
Bill, is it like a credit card where the credit card company sends me a statement, it says I need to pay my X amount of minimum payments. If I choose to do less, I'm going to get penalties and interest. Is that something, is that similar to what the states are doing?
Well,
Bill?
it's similar in the sense that they effectively balance their budget with credit cards. It's almost an oxymoron in the way that, for instance, the governmental funds accounting standards allow state and local governments to count borrowing proceeds as resources. And then in turn, for instance, the state of Illinois recently had an asserted budget surplus of $87 million that depended in important part on an expectation of more than $5 billion of either borrowing or federal aid that's uncertain legally whether either one of those are going to arrive with the borrowing from the Federal Reserve. It's and so it's almost, they can balance their budget with their credit cards, which is a way to grow in the short run, but in the long run, how sustainable is it is we're going to find out.
Yeah, and Congress hasn't even passed, the HEROES Act or any additional aid to the states. But Illinois is already, counting on that money is going to come in. Eileen, you mentioned about pension plans, and those are woefully underfunded. But I think, what about the unfunded retiree healthcare liabilities? A lot of people hear about pensions. Is that an area that we should be concerned about too?
I think so, although I will add the caveat that it's unclear the extent to which these benefits are as protected as pensions. I believe in Illinois they are as protected as pensions, but in other states that may not be the case. So there's a possibility that the government, they're not as guaranteed. That being said, there's a real range in funding for healthcare benefits in the states, the OPEB obligations. Utah they're almost half funded, which is pretty good, relatively speaking. But then we've got, well over a dozen states that have no funding set aside. So they're on a pay-as-you-go basis, and many other states that have less than 10% funding. So the great majority of them are looking at a pay-as-you-go or nearly a pay-as-you-go system. And of course, as the employees in these plans get older, and as that cohort gets older, this becomes more of a risk.
Yeah, and Bill, in the article, there was a mention, that we calculated or estimated or did something to come up with a good guess, I think it was, on that the combined, the states are going to lose $397 billion of revenue during this crisis. Can anybody truly estimate how much the states are going to lose?
Having tried to do it, I'd say the answer is no, Sheila. We had a quote unquote projection. It's not a prediction. It's really not even a projection. It's more like a scenario. The assumptions you have to make to come up with a number that's defensible are subject to a great deal of uncertainty. And as a consequence, we don't believe that any federal, people can differ about whether or not they think a federal bailout is appropriate. Let's just put that aside for now. Some people believe it isn't. But having said that, any future aid to the states should not be linked to any projection about future economic conditions and or because of the malleability of the assumptions under the modeling.
Well, what should it be based upon if you're not gonna, if you don't have a, people are throwing out, they need, $1 trillion, $2 trillion, and Congress has a tendency to just throw money at this point, it's throw money at everything and life will be fine. I don't know where they're getting all that money, but that's another topic. How should they calculate how much the states and local governments get?
Well, a simple and pithy answer would be you could use 0 as one response. Some people believe that's the right answer. However, politically, that's probably not going to be what we're going to see going forward. And again, I wouldn't use any projections for losses, but we can be looking at, say, actual revenue shortfalls from pre-pandemic periods, say, for instance, for 2019. That could be your benchmark for how to fill in the gap. Whether that gap should be filled in completely is another matter of debate. You're setting up some moral hazard there if you make up the gap completely. And as a result, well, we shouldn't be using it. We shouldn't be using projections that are tossed about.
Yeah. And then Eileen, Bill talked a little bit about what Congress should or shouldn't do. Do you have any thoughts on what, if Congress decides to throw out another, throw some more money at it, if they decide to do that, what should or shouldn't they do in relation to that?
Well, a few ideas. I think Bill's on the right track there with saying that, we should look at previous shortfalls as a benchmark for any sort of funding that should be given to the states for the explicit purpose of closing budget gaps. It should be tied to perhaps a percentage of the funding gap, and we should also look to what they've got set aside in their rainy day funds. Some of these states, in fact, do have sufficient funds to cover at least part of that gap. So I think it has to be, there has to be some analysis that looks at what is the actual gap, what are the actual needs, not based on projections or wish lists. Secondly, one could ask for reforms in exchange for the funds, where there are states that have habitually not undertaken fiscally prudent practices in funding their pensions or in accounting for them accurately. Perhaps some reforms should be required that put pensions on better footing. Because indeed, I mean, we've been warning about this for well over a decade, the risks inherent in these funds. And where there hasn't been changed behavior, the question is then, this is where accounting rules interact with the budget constraint, that budget constraint that exists in state governments. And there's a Professor Barry Weingast who has noted that where you don't have, where the budget constraint is violated, where the federal government bails out the lower levels of government, it ends up signaling a weaker discipline to the lower level of governments. And the extent to which we keep doing that, we have to call into question the integrity of our federalist arrangement, our fiscal federalism. So these are great questions.
The states have balanced budget requirements, and it would kind of circumvent those, because it's like, oh, well, I can get, if I run into trouble, I can get money from the federal government. Well, let's turn to questions from the audience. I know Bill and I and Eileen could talk amongst ourselves all day on this topic, but we'll get to some questions from the audience. One is, how can the state's audited financial statement, called the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, be revised to make it possible for the average citizen to understand? Any thoughts on that, Eileen?
That's a great question. As one who reads them with some frequency, I can say that it's a slog, and I don't think they're user friendly for the public. I think that we undertook a project at Mercatus to try to come up with metrics that would extract some basic information on the cash position, the unfunded liabilities, the debt position, in order to prompt that conversation. How do you operationalize the CAFR to make it intelligible to the average citizen? And I think there's some work that needs to be done there, whether it's, you could still have your CAFR that's meant for for accountants, but how do we extract information from that to give people a snapshot of the fiscal health of the state? And those metrics should be based on an accurate accounting that includes all of the debt and all of the off-budget accounts and the full picture, not just a segment of the operations of government.
The state and local governments could do that, but we do it at Truth in Accounting. Every year we have our financial state of the states report, which has a 2-page valid summary of and understandable, clear presentation of the net position of state and local governments. So we've been trying to do that.
Well, yeah. And, you know, we found it very confusing in the state of Illinois. The comptroller issued a press release when she issued her 2019 financial report that said that the state general fund deficit had actually decreased by $6.8 billion. And if you look into the financial statements, you'll find that yes, they did increase by that amount, but again, those statements are done on the cash basis. So she was able to include a refinancing scheme that they'd done, and that added $6 billion of quote revenue to the general fund. So the way that those funds are accounted for need to be changed, and we're working with like we worked with pensions to get pensions changed. We're working with the Government Accounting Standards Board to get those changed. Next question was, did Sweden or other countries moved from a defined benefit program to a defined contribution program? And since we do have a lot of listeners, Eileen, if you can explain the difference between those before you answer, and how did that happen? And was it an easy transition, or do you know enough about some international things in addition to the states?
Thank you. Yes, a defined benefit plan is one in which an employee is guaranteed a certain fraction of their income upon retirement that is based on some formula, their final average salary, a multiplier, years of service. And based on that formula, you are entitled to a payout over your retired years for the work you did as a government employee. So the government is essentially supposed to be setting aside money for you on an annual basis, according to a formula that they will pay out based on an annuity in your retired years. And in the public sector, those are guaranteed often in statute and constitution. So they're promised benefits. A defined contribution plan, and I should also note that the risk of underfunding is really borne by the taxpayer in the public sector. So if there is a funding gap, the risk is then, as Bill noted, socialized over the taxpayer. In a defined contribution plan, the employee sets aside a portion of their own income, and it is invested in their choice of portfolio, and then that money is available to them. They can draw down that money when they reach retirement. And that's a very common plan in the private sector, and of course it's now being offered in the public sector as well in some cases. The risk there is borne by the employee, and that's based on the performance of their own investments. In defined benefits, the sponsor of the plan is the one investing those contributions and assets and making those choices on behalf of the plan and the employees. So to the question, I have not really studied international examples of transitioning from defined benefit to defined contribution plans, but I have looked a little bit at US examples, and there are a few states that have moved, some of them early adopters, moving from defined benefit to defined contribution. That would include Michigan in the 90s, moved some of their employees to the defined contribution plan, and that seems to have gone relatively well. Alaska is another state that closed its defined benefit plan a while ago, and they are now new employees have been moving into the defined contribution plan. And then West Virginia did open up a defined contribution plan well over a decade ago, but then they moved back to the defined benefit plan. In recent years, a few other states have either introduced hybrid plans or defined contribution plans for new employees. Michigan, I would say, is the most advanced in terms of transitioning their employees from the defined benefit to the defined contribution plan.
Yeah, and I think a lot of corporations have gotten rid of their defined benefit. Bill, do you think that has anything to do with the passage of in the, I think it was the 1970s, I think, I could be wrong on that, of the ERISA, where corporations had to start accounting for their plans more conservatively and had to actually properly fund the benefits they were promising.
Well, in theory, ERISA is supposed to be a solution. Whether or not it is, we're learning lessons that it isn't necessarily a panacea either with the multi-employer plans in the United States. But just stepping back to the idea that, you know, as taxpayers, you and I, we may not want to be in the stock market, but effectively we are if our state and local government pension plans are guaranteed under defined benefit schemes and they're predominantly invested in equities. We're faced with the downside.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's why on our financial state of the states and financial state of the cities, we call it a taxpayer burden, because the taxpayers are going to be burdened with paying these pensions, whether no matter what the stock market does. I always find it funny when after the stock market takes a hit, I'll hear, "Oh, thank God I'm not in the stock market." I'll hear a lot of people say, and I'm like, you are, because your state and local governments are in the stock market, and if they lose money, they're going to come to you to pay the benefits. Eileen, you mentioned rainy day funds and that they were getting better. You know, rainy days funds. I don't know if they're a good thing or bad thing. I guess they're good if you have a rainy day to have extra cash set aside. But like California had the largest rainy day fund, but they had more than $250 billion of unfunded pensions, OPEB, and other debts. So can you really have a rainy day fund and have that much debt at the same time?
That's a really great question. It has to do with you know, ring fencing those funds for their intended purpose. It's to cover shortfalls in the budget. So that doesn't necessarily cover the pension per se. Although I take your point that how can you have these funds over here and yet you've got these gaps elsewhere in your finances. Rainy day funds have proven to be, I think, you know, beneficial in that it at least gives states a resource when there is a recession and they need to meet those spending shortfalls in the budget. And we have seen improvements there over the last decade with states setting more funds aside. That being said, the rules around rainy day funds really do matter. You should be setting aside windfalls to cover shortfalls and disciplining legislatures to make that contribution and to withdraw it only for emergencies and not for new spending projects. And of course, you can actually make the rules a little too tight and make the funds inaccessible. So it has to be calibrated appropriately for that specific purpose. When there is a recession and there's an actual event that requires that legislatures draw on these funds to fill an actual spending gap, it's not a fund you just dip into because you have new spending projects you want to bring online.
In thinking about the rainy day funds versus the net position of the government in light of the pension obligations, I'm reminded of the crisscrossing effects of reserve requirements compared to capital requirements in banking, both of which have historically been regulated in theory to promote the stability of our banking system. Whether they succeeded is another question, unfortunately. But in theory, banks are required to have a certain amount of positive capital against their assets. Looking at our state and local governments, many of them, including the pension funds that they sponsor, they're balance sheet insolvent, massively insolvent. They don't have positive capital positions. That's another cushion for a rainy day. It's not a rainy day fund, but it's part of the overall health of the state and local governments and the pension funds. And we don't have it in many cases in the United States today.
Eileen, you mentioned somebody asked a question that came to mind when you mentioned bankruptcy, that some of the local governments had gone bankrupt. Is that something that, you know, why can't states go bankrupt? And should they be able to go bankrupt?
Yeah, that's been a really interesting question. And it came to the fore during the last recession. where the question was raised by David Skeel, who is a professor at UPenn. Why can't states declare bankruptcy? Why can't we modify the bankruptcy code to allow for that? Because we have states like Illinois where the solutions seem impossible. So that's still being debated, but some thoughts on that. If we were to have that, first of all, even the threat of bankruptcy may be enough to change state behavior. Because they realize that just the specter of bankruptcy means your credit rating is going to drop and borrowing costs are going to go up. If you were to have bankruptcy for the states, though, you'd have to, I think, learn from the municipal example, which is that even when entities like municipalities such as Vallejo and Stockton were given the ability by the bankruptcy court to reform those unfunded pension liabilities or reduce them, they said, no, we don't want to do that. So in a case, let's say like Illinois, you would be able to, if the state, and it would be the state that would have the option to declare bankruptcy, the creditors should not be given the option to sue for bankruptcy. So it would be the state would have to undertake it itself. It would be under the supremacy clause of the US Constitution, and that would preempt state constitutional restrictions. So it would get around some of these rules that have prevented pension obligations from being dealt with in a case like Illinois. But it would be a complex process. Certainly, there's a reason why people are talking about it, but it has not actually gotten as far as to be an actual tool that states can use.
Well, yeah, but you're kind of pointing to the pension plans and that these are underfunded and that they need to be changed. But I'm sure the employees would come to you and say, well, hold on. I have a contract here. My contract was to work for less pay, so I get a higher pension. And now you're saying you're going to take that benefit that you promised me away. Is that really fair, Eileen?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I think we have to take a hard look at the finances when you look at Illinois' unfunded liabilities. First of all, what are we reducing? Is it benefits earned to date or benefits that are not yet earned? So when we look at Illinois' unfunded liability, we also know that Illinois promises to protect benefits not yet earned, and that would strike a lot of people as excessive in terms of protection. As to benefits earned to date, I think we can only go by precedent and look at cases like Detroit for some kind of information on how you would unwind certain benefits where the size of those benefits, what promised, exceeds the economy of the state on some level. I mean, where are you going to get the revenues from is the question. And there has to be a test for bankruptcy. Is it possible to raise taxes? Is it possible to cut spending? What are the other levers at the state's disposal? And so the state would have to come up with a plan and see, what makes sense and how to do the least harm in such a proceeding. But the standard of proof would be very high, and the state has to initiate it.
Yeah, and isn't this scheme part of this whole balanced budget thing we're talking about? Because they're like, well, we're going to pay the employees less now, so their paychecks are less, and so I can more easily balance my budget, and those pensions I don't need to worry about until the future. So the question is, how does another question from the audience is how is it possible that states can use these deceptive budgeting and accounting games to quote balance their budgets, Eileen?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I think a lot of your work shows, Sheila, that it's a puzzle because it gets back into the accounting standards, and what is done for a household should make sense for governments, and yet we have a completely separate set of rules operating in government in terms of how things are calculated, how they're reported, how they're defined. And I think that's what we're looking at is, indeed, how do they, quote unquote, get away with it? I think we get back down into how they even report and evaluate their own finances. And out of sight, out of mind has been operating for a very long time, where it is perceived that, it's okay to issue this debt or not pay for the pension obligation or the pension contribution annually, that somehow the future will take care of it. These assumptions would not be the ones in operation in the private sector? And I think that's the question. Why are there different standards in the public versus the private sector for how debts and pension obligations are measured and funded?
And Bill,
The question,
can
how
you
do they,
fill the audience
how are they
with-
able to get away with it, I guess was kind of the audience question. And one other simple way to answer that is that we let them get away with it. And who is we is the next question. In any failing scenario for any corporation or organization, you've got a variety of different parties that are exposed to the cost of the failure. In the case of a corporation, shareholders and bondholders don't always, they're not always on the same page. And here, with the situation that we're faced with today, citizens and taxpayers on the one hand aren't necessarily thinking like the pensioners or the bondholders. There's a variety of different interests in seeing how this is going to be resolved down the road. If anybody should have been watching the hen house, perhaps the pensioners and the public sector unions should have been watching the ability of the state and local governments to short the pension plan and balance their budget. And yet that didn't happen. That source of discipline didn't happen, which is a problem.
Yeah, and somebody's asking, should the accounting rules be consolidated into FASB and not GASB? And other people are saying, well, audience members are saying, well, aren't the governments using generally accepted accounting principles? So, Bill, are there two sets of generally accepted accounting principles, or what's going on there?
There's actually 4 main accounting standard setters in the United States. Not only 2, but historically the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board, a few decades ago splintered more or less into allowing the GASB to become the new governmental accounting standard setter in the United States. And in turn, the risk was that, on the one hand, the government said we needed our own set of accounting standards. On the other hand, it's possible they did so in their own, at least short-term self-interest. And whether or not GASB was effectively captured by governments, not necessarily producing standards that are valuable for citizens and taxpayers and other stakeholders, is an important question.
Yeah, and I think we question GASB's independence because most of the members are either government official, current or former government officials, or have a vested interest on how the standards come out. So another question from the audience is, what is the end game for states like Illinois and California, New Jersey, where they're horribly in debt, and if they can't go bankrupt, Eileen, do we have any idea what's gonna happen?
No, it is a great question. We don't know how this is going to play out. There is an impossibility factor in the numbers. If you look at New Jersey and Illinois, these are extremely large unfunded liabilities relative to the state economy. I think it's larger in Illinois than in New Jersey. So then the question becomes, is there going to be a future renegotiation of benefits or other obligations in the state? I don't know that if it's mathematically possible to pay out what is owed, and it's better to start that now than wait to find out in a crisis. And it's as I think Bill mentioned, who's suffering here? I mean, the public employees who sign up for a job and were told that their benefits would be guaranteed and they were going to be given a certain level of benefits. Why wasn't there more oversight over the years in terms of the integrity of the funding of these plans? That is a great question. And I want to highlight just the amount of risk, and this is very almost baffling to me. Pensions are doing the exact opposite of what a financial planner would tell you to do as an individual for your retirement savings, in that over time they've taken on more risk. As I mentioned at the beginning, in the last 20 years, the amount of risk these plans are exposed to has increased. They're chasing returns in order to make up for losses. Since 2001, they've on average, pensions have returned 6.4% annually. They're assuming, however, they're going to return on average 7.5%. They are exposed to stocks and alternatives at about 77% of their portfolio. And that's as people are aging in these plans. And that's the opposite of what you would do as an individual. As you age and approach retirement, you take on less risk in your investments, and yet these plans are taking on more and seem to be doing so in a crisis moment that they want to make up for lost returns. But they're not learning that there's a downside to that. You're introducing more volatility and a greater risk premium. And according to Fitch, credit rating agency, pensions have tripled their average investment in alternatives since 2007, from 9% to 27% in alternatives. And again, I mean, it gets into who's monitoring this, and the employees should have something to say about how their retirement funds are being invested.
Bill, aren't the funds, aren't the pension plans run by trustees? Well, do they have, what are the trustees doing?
Well, the trustees, among other things, have fiduciary duties as trustees. They're told to work for the pensioners. And if that's true, if you have a fiduciary duty to work for the pensioner, but for a defined benefit pensioner whose benefits are guaranteed on the fixed benefits that he expects or she expects, you have an incentive to take more risk to make the plan bigger, because the pensioner doesn't take the downside. There's a similar set of affairs in banking, where Edward Kane, a professor of finance at Boston College, and a fellow who wrote 2 books before the S&L crisis warning us what was coming, that we didn't know was coming. Ed has some very interesting ideas about we should alter the fiduciary duties of too big to fail institutions in our financial markets. They should be not just working for shareholders, but for working for taxpayers at the same time, because effectively taxpayers are taking a bad form of equity. They get the downside, not the upside. And you can make an argument that the state pension fund trustees should have their duties circumscribed in a similar fashion.
So Bill, you're saying that the trustees don't they have a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers in addition to the pensioners, or?
Not in general under current law. Maybe depending on how broadly you define your duty to the, if you're a far-sighted pension fund trustee and you see the fact that it's going to hit the fan down the road, maybe there's an incentive to take less risk in your pension fund. Unfortunately, they're undeniably in risky investments today, and they've reaped the fruits of a massive recovery in our financial markets since 2009. That's another thing that's extraordinary and scary. The financial position of many of the pension funds in the United States has actually deteriorated since 2009, despite the fact that we've had this huge recovery in our financial markets. And we can't count on that in the future.
Now, Eileen, you mentioned that, the federal government, when they give out money, there should be consideration to how much money, like California had a very large rainy day fund. Aren't you kind of penalizing, and then they would get less federal aid, federal bailout? Aren't you kind of penalizing those states for for doing a good job in setting up the rainy day funds?
I suppose you could see it that way, although I think that it's a very pragmatic solution that, if you are seeking federal funds, what is it for? You should not be rewarded in excess of the gap you're actually facing, including your own resources. So I think I understand the point that it would seem to reward those who have not saved enough for a rainy day, yet at the same time, that's the purpose of the rainy day fund.
Well, should Congress set any conditions for the future? Should they just give them this money and here, bail them out, or should they set up any conditions like a rainy day fund or pension fund? Should there be any conditions when they throw money at them?
Certainly, Andrew Biggs and I have put out a recent brief in which we said this: if they're going to be giving money to the states with the explicit intention of bailing out pension systems, then that should come with some requirements that states move their employees to a defined contribution plan, as they have, or undertake some form of pension reform. As this is a highly predictable position they've put themselves in, and it's been noted over a long period of time that these were huge fiscal risks in many states. So I think it is only fair to say that it should come with some kind of requirement for future reform.
And Bill, does Truth in Accounting look at municipal budgets, or, somebody's asking, is there a way that I can analyze my city's budget? Do you have any suggestions in that area?
Well, the websites are getting better and better over time throughout America. You can look at for instance, the Office of Management and Budget website at the state of Illinois, and they have budget books, and they have reports that are given to the citizens. But at the same time, you've got to read it with a jaundiced eye because of the budget accounting, and look carefully. For instance, the Illinois table included those resources I mentioned. They had two line items that had two line items apiece on the one line item. The fact that on the one hand, we expect federal aid to be forthcoming, but if it isn't, then we're going to have borrowing. And so that one line was really two lines, but they were expecting things that aren't certain and calling them resources, effectively revenues. And so you've got to be reading budget documents with a very careful and cynical view, unfortunately, until we change the accounting for the funds accounting.
Yeah, and we, at Truth in Accounting, we, consider the budget's almost a political document. The financial reports, we have made some improvements, and especially at what they call the government-wide basis. They do now put their pension liabilities on there. So if you want to learn more about your government's finances, I highly recommend you go to Truth in Accounting's website and look for our How to Read a CAFR video, and it will highlight where you should look to understand the true financial condition of your government. Another
It's a good point, Sheila. I just got to recommend that, there are words and there are deeds. And in a sense, budgets are prospective, forward-looking documents that aren't, whether or not they really walk the talk, the CAFR does give you information along those lines.
Yeah, and that's why we're trying to get the general fund accounting changed. So again, people could look at the audited financial statements and see whether that was truly balanced. Another question is, how about the relationship between state and local governments? We haven't talked about the cities. What expenses will likely be downstream to the localities as the state's revenues plummet and they don't have enough money? Eileen?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's going to vary from place to place, but it's definitely a level we should be looking at. And we found in the last recession that indeed there were cuts made to local budgets in many states because the funds simply weren't there. Those transfer payments either from the state to the local government for existing programs or for, in some cases, even contributions to local pension funds. In the case of Pennsylvania, there was, I think, some changes to their funding formula. So yes, I mean, I think that is definitely an area where states will occasionally have no choice but to reduce those transfers to the local government. And it can come in the form of programs or just general fiscal transfers.
There's a variety of conditions around the nation. For instance, Tennessee, you've got a state that's in pretty good shape, but the cities aren't necessarily where you might expect given how good the state is. On the flip side, here in Illinois, we've got both Illinois and Chicago, and it's going to be hard for either one of those entities to find friendly pockets in each other's financial statements.
Yeah, so what you're saying, I think, Eileen, if I heard you correct, is that the cities and the local government school districts, as their revenues are plummeting, also that you're expecting that even less money from state aid. Did I hear you correctly?
It's a possibility, and I haven't looked at any of the current numbers, but in the recession of 2008, we did see that some of those streams were at least reduced. And there were pain points in between the state and the localities in terms of funds being transferred from the states to the local governments for programs. So there was an effect. And I would expect you might see the same in this case.
Somebody's asking a California resident, and their pensions are woefully underfunded. Can you share your thoughts on, has there been studies on whether government employees are getting higher pensions than private sector employees, and or have people looked at whether, okay, the employees say, well, we're paid less when we work, but our pensions are higher. Is there a studies on total compensation, and are the government employees actually paid higher overall than private sector employees?
There have been studies along those lines, and I would point to Andrew Biggs's work at AEI. I believe he's looked at comparative compensation for both benefits and for salary for public sector and private employees. And I believe he's looked at different occupational groups as well. Those studies are relatively recent. So yes, there has been analysis along those lines.
And should, back to the federal government bailing out the states, quote unquote, should the quote bailout be based, what should that be based upon? Bill said actuals. Should it be based on a per capita? Should it be based on actual shortfalls? Just what, because if you do actual shortfalls, then governments that tax more, will get more money, and the states, other states will say, well, how come just because we don't tax a lot on a state level, why should we get a lesser bailout?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are pros and cons to any approach here. I do think it, as Bill said before, should not be based on projections, but actual experience. And perhaps some fraction of that, not the entire shortfall, but some fraction of it. That recognizes that you should have your own resources at the table as well. So, I would say that any approach, whether it be per capita or we're talking about second bests here when we're talking about bailouts. Certainly, it's not an ideal. And as mentioned before, the more that hard budget constraint is violated, the less discipline the locality is going to have in future to. Are we baking in the expectation of future bailouts? With every bailout, do we bake in yet a greater expectation for the future? So any bailout provision is going to be, again, second best, and how you structure it, I would just, second what Bill said is don't go off of wish lists, but rather reality and maybe some formula basis to deal with the crisis at hand, and in a targeted way.
And sadly, we also have to think that, when Eileen's talking about second best solutions, maybe we should try to think about a best solution, and maybe no bailout is that solution.
Yeah, some people agree. I'm going to take the last question and then closing comments, which is, where can people find more information about their states, which just keys me up to our truthinaccounting.org website, or, even better, go to our data-z.org website where you can click on your individual state and it will pull up your financial state of that state. And you can also find your audited financial statement there. You can also do that for all the 75 most populated cities. So I'm just going to click over to my closing comments because those are on a different screen, which I have misplaced, but I will find it. Just one moment. Well, anyway, I'll just do it off the top of my head since I can't find them on my computer. But thank you, Eileen, so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Bill, for your expertise today and always at Truth in Accounting as our research director. Thanks for the Union League Club for co-sponsoring this. We were happy to get them involved and their members. And if you want more information about Truth in Accounting, go to our website, truthinaccounting.org, or our data-z.org. And Eileen, where can they get information about your organization?
You can visit mercatus.org.
Oh, great. Well, again, thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Bill. Thank everybody for joining us. Feel free, we're planning more of these as we're all under house arrest. This is how we can get to you. So if you want topics, let us know. And we will send out information about future ones. Stay healthy and stay safe, and we will and have a great day. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Eileen.
Thank you.
Fun to be with you.